August 15, 1971, Camp David, Maryland. President Richard Nixon gathered 15 advisors in secret. No formal agenda, no press, no foreign governments notified. The meeting had been announced as a weekend economic policy discussion, routine enough not to raise suspicion. In reality, it was the most consequential monetary decision since Franklin Roosevelt confiscated gold in 1933. Treasury Secretary John Connally presented the plan: close the gold window, end the convertibility of dollars into gold at the fixed $35 per ounce rate, abandon the Bretton Woods system that had governed international monetary relations since 1944. The system that had provided monetary stability for a generation would end not through negotiation or crisis, but through unilateral American action announced without warning. The advisors debated through Friday and Saturday. Some objected. Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns argued it would destroy confidence in the dollar internationally. State Department officials warned of retaliation from Europe and Japan, who would view this as betrayal. Economic advisors worried about inflation that would inevitably follow once the constraint of gold convertibility was removed. Connally dismissed every concern with characteristic bluntness. "Foreigners are out to screw us," he said. "It's our currency, but it's their problem." His argument was simple. The United States created the international monetary system after World War II. We could change it. Foreign governments depended on access to American markets and military protection. They would complain loudly and ultimately acquiesce. They had no choice. Nixon agreed with Connally. The political calculation was clear. He was running for re-election in 1972. The economy was struggling, inflation was rising, unemployment was increasing. The Vietnam War was draining resources. Closing the gold window would allow unlimited monetary expansion to stimulate the economy through the election. The long-term consequences, inflation, debt, monetary instability, could be dealt with by future administrations. The immediate political benefit was what mattered. Nixon made the decision. That evening at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, he would address the nation. He would announce that the United States was suspending temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold. The temporary suspension would become permanent. The Bretton Woods system would end, and money as the world had known it for nearly 3 decades would fundamentally change. The speech lasted 15 minutes. By the time it ended, the global monetary system had been destroyed, and every dollar in existence became backed not by gold, but by the promise of the US government, a promise that would be tested, broken, and redefined over the next 50 years. Understanding what Nixon did on August 15, 1971 is essential to understanding everything that has happened since. The inflation of the 1970s, the explosion of government debt, the 2008 financial crisis, the money printing of the 2020s. None of it would have been possible under Bretton Woods. Nixon didn't just change monetary policy, he removed the constraints that had limited governments for generations. Bretton Woods was created in July 1944 at a conference in New Hampshire. 44 nations sent delegates to design the post-war monetary system. The agreement fixed exchange rates between currencies. The dollar was pegged at $35 per ounce of gold. Other currencies were pegged to the dollar. Any foreign central bank could exchange dollars for gold at the fixed rate. The system gave the world monetary stability while giving the United States a privilege. Dollars became the global reserve currency. Other countries held dollars to back their own currencies. They accumulated dollars through trade surpluses with the US and could redeem those dollars for gold at Fort Knox whenever they chose. This constraint mattered. If the United States printed too many dollars, foreign governments would demand gold. The US gold reserves would deplete. To maintain the system, the US had to limit dollar creation. There was a brake on monetary expansion. The gold window enforced discipline. For 2 decades, the system worked. Global trade grew. Economies rebuilt after World War II. Exchange rates stayed stable. Countries knew what their currencies were worth in relation to gold and to each other. The constraint was accepted as the price of stability. But by the late 1960s, the constraint was becoming unbearable. The Vietnam War required massive spending. President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs, Medicare, Medicaid, urban development, demanded funding. The United States was spending far more than it collected in taxes. The federal government ran deficits. Those deficits were financed by printing dollars. Foreign central banks noticed. They were accumulating dollars faster than they wanted. France was particularly aggressive. President Charles de Gaulle distrusted American monetary policy and explicitly sought to weaken US financial dominance. In 1965, France began converting dollars to gold. Other countries followed. By 1971, the US gold reserves had fallen from 20,000 tons in 1952 under 9,000 tons. The math was becoming impossible. Foreign central banks held $80 billion in dollar claims. US gold reserves at $35 per ounce were worth about $10 billion. If even a fraction of those dollar claims were presented for conversion, the United States would run out of gold. The Bretton Woods system was built on a promise the US could no longer keep. Nixon faced a choice: cut spending drastically in the Vietnam War, scale back Great Society programs, balance the budget. or break the promise and close the gold window. Cutting spending would be politically disastrous. He was running for re-election in 1972. Ending popular programs and losing the war were non-starters. The choice was obvious. The decision was made in secret to prevent a run on gold. If foreign governments knew the announcement was coming, they would rush to convert dollars before the window closed. The United States would lose what remained of its gold reserves in days, maybe hours. Secrecy was essential. On Friday, August 13th, Nixon gathered advisors at Camp David under the pretext of discussing economic policy. Treasury officials prepared the technical details. Speechwriters crafted the announcement. No one outside the inner circle knew what was coming. Not the Federal Reserve, not Congress, not U.S. allies, certainly not the American public. August 15th was chosen deliberately. It was a Sunday. Markets were closed. Foreign governments would have no time to react. By Monday morning, when trading resumed, the decision would be final. There would be no negotiation, no warning, just fait accompli. At 9 p.m. Eastern Time, Nixon appeared on television. 70 million Americans watched. He framed the decision as protecting American workers from international speculators. "I am directing Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold," he announced. The word temporarily was a lie. Everyone in Camp David knew it, but it softened the shock. Nixon continued. The suspension was necessary to prevent international speculators from profiting at America's expense. He portrayed closing the gold window as defending the dollar, not abandoning it. He linked the decision to wage and price controls he was simultaneously announcing, presenting the entire package as bold action to protect American prosperity. The speech lasted 15 minutes. By the time it ended, the Bretton Woods system was over. Foreign governments woke up Monday morning to discover their dollar reserves could no longer be exchanged for gold. The United States had unilaterally rewritten the rules of the international monetary system. Reaction was swift and chaotic. European markets plunged when they opened Monday morning. Currency trading was suspended in multiple countries as governments scrambled to understand the implications. Finance ministers issued angry statements. French President Georges Pompidou called it unilateral action that upset the world monetary system. German Chancellor Willy Brandt described it as a violation of international agreements. British officials were furious. They hadn't been consulted despite the special relationship, but there was nothing anyone could do. The US had closed the window. The gold was staying in Fort Knox. Foreign central banks held $80 billion in dollar claims they could no longer redeem. Those dollars were now backed not by gold but by American promises. The value of those dollars would be determined not by a fixed parity to gold but by markets, confidence, and US monetary policy. Japan's response was particularly revealing. The Bank of Japan held massive dollar reserves accumulated through trade surpluses. Those reserves represented years of exports to the United States. In a single evening, the guarantee behind those reserves had evaporated. Japanese officials protested vigorously but privately. Publicly, they had to maintain good relations with their largest trading partner and military protector. This pattern would repeat. Loud private objections, muted public response, ultimate acceptance. Switzerland initially refused to accept the new reality. The Swiss franc had been pegged to the dollar under Bretton Woods. Swiss officials attempted to maintain the peg even after Nixon's announcement, arguing that abandoning it would destroy monetary stability. They bought dollars to support the rate, but the selling pressure was overwhelming. Within weeks, Switzerland gave up. The franc floated. Even Switzerland, famous for monetary conservatism, couldn't maintain fixed rates in the new world Nixon had created. Over the next 2 years, countries attempted to negotiate a return to fixed exchange rates. The Smithsonian Agreement in December 1971 established new parities with a devalued dollar, $38 per ounce of gold instead of $35. But the fundamental problem remained. The US was still printing more dollars than its gold could support. In February 1973, the Smithsonian Agreement collapsed. Fixed exchange rates were abandoned. Currencies floated. Bretton Woods was definitively dead. What replaced it was a system of pure fiat currencies. Money was no longer backed by gold or any other commodity. It was backed by government promises. The value of a dollar was whatever the market said it was worth based on trust in the US government's ability and willingness to maintain that value. This change had profound consequences. With no gold constraint, there was no limit to dollar creation beyond political will. The Federal Reserve could print as much money as the government wanted to borrow. And the government wanted to borrow a lot. Inflation exploded almost immediately and in ways that shocked economists. In 1971, inflation was 4.3%. By 1974, it reached 11%. By 1980, it peaked at 13.5%. Prices doubled during the decade. Savings were destroyed. Workers demanded wage increases to keep pace. Businesses raised prices to cover costs. The wage price spiral fed on itself in a self-reinforcing cycle that seemed impossible to break. The inflation wasn't evenly distributed. Food prices rose first 30% between 1972 and 1974. Energy followed after the 1973 oil embargo, with gasoline prices tripling. Housing costs surged as inflation expectations became embedded in long-term contracts and mortgage rates. By the late 1970s, mortgage rates exceeded 15%. Buyers could barely afford homes. Sellers demanded protection against future inflation. The entire pricing system was distorted by the expectation that dollars would be worth less tomorrow than today. Seniors on fixed incomes were devastated. A pension that seemed adequate in 1970 bought half as much by 1980. Social Security payments increased through cost of living adjustments, but they lagged inflation and provided incomplete protection. Retirees who had saved diligently under the gold standard watched their life savings lose purchasing power annually. The social contract, work hard, save, retire comfortably, was broken by monetary policy. The Federal Reserve attempted to control inflation by raising interest rates. But every time rates rose high enough to slow the economy, political pressure forced the Fed to back down. Recessions were unpopular. Elections were coming. President Ford tried to combat inflation with whip inflation, now buttons and voluntary restraint. It failed completely. President Carter appointed Paul Volcker as Fed chairman in 1979 with a mandate to break inflation regardless of cost. Volcker raised the federal funds rate to 20% by 1981. The economy crashed into the worst recession since the Great Depression. Unemployment exceeded 10%. Manufacturing collapsed. Farmers went bankrupt as high interest rates made equipment loans unsustainable. Political pressure to reverse course was immense. Volcker held firm. Inflation finally broke. By 1983 it had fallen below 4%. The cost was a destroyed Midwest industrial base, massive unemployment, and a lost generation of economic opportunity for millions. But inflation was defeated. The second consequence was the explosion of government debt. Under Bretton Woods, excessive borrowing risked gold outflows. After 1971, the constraint was gone. Deficits could be financed by selling bonds to the Federal Reserve, which paid for them with newly printed dollars. The federal debt in 1971 was $398 billion. By 2000 it was $5.6 trillion. Today it exceeds $36 trillion. The pattern is clear. Before 1971, the debt-to-GDP ratio declined or stayed stable. After 1971, it exploded. Every recession was met with stimulus spending. Every war was financed with borrowing. Every crisis was solved with monetary expansion. The constraint that had limited government for generations was gone. The third consequence was the financialization of the economy. With floating exchange rates and unlimited dollar creation, currency trading became a major industry. Speculation in foreign exchange markets grew exponentially. Derivatives, futures, options, financial instruments that didn't exist under Bretton Woods proliferated. Money was no longer just a medium of exchange, it became a tradable commodity. This created new opportunities but also new instabilities. Currency crises became frequent. Mexico 1982, Thailand 1997, Argentina 2001, Turkey 2018. Each followed the same pattern. Borrow in dollars, print local currency excessively, confidence collapses, currency crashes. Under Bretton Woods with fixed rates, these crises couldn't happen the same way. After 1971, they became routine. The fourth consequence was the transfer of wealth from savers to debtors. Inflation benefits those who owe money and punishes those who save it. If you borrowed money at a fixed rate and inflation doubles prices, you're repaying the debt with money that's worth half as much. Debtors won. Savers lost. Governments were the biggest beneficiaries. The U.S. government in 1971 owed $398 billion. Over the next decades, inflation eroded the real value of that debt, while new borrowing expanded at inflated prices. The government effectively defaulted on its obligations through inflation without formally declaring bankruptcy. The fifth consequence was the severing of the relationship between money and real value. Under the gold standard, dollars represented a claim on something tangible. After 1971, dollars represented only a promise. The supply of dollars could expand infinitely. The supply of real goods and services could not. The gap between paper wealth and real wealth widened. This gap became visible in asset bubbles. Stock market valuations reached levels that would have been impossible under a gold standard because there wouldn't have been enough money to bid prices that high. Real estate prices soared beyond what incomes could support. The disconnection between monetary expansion and economic fundamentals created the conditions for 2008. The 2008 financial crisis was a direct consequence of post-1971 monetary policy. Banks lent recklessly because they knew the Fed would provide liquidity. Borrowers took on debt beyond their means because money was cheap. Regulators assumed markets would self-correct because they didn't understand that removing the gold anchor had removed the correction mechanism. When the bubble burst, the response was more of what caused the problem. Print money and bail out the losers. The pattern visible across these stages from artificial stability through crisis to money printing mirrors what guides like the 7-stage collapse survival guide document. Each crisis follows predictable progression because the underlying incentive structure remains unchanged. Governments prefer printing money to facing political consequences. This preference, unconstrained after 1971, drives the cycle. Today we're living with the full consequences of Nixon's decision. The federal debt exceeds $36 trillion and grows by over $2 trillion annually. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet exploded from under $1 trillion in 2008 to over $8 trillion by 2022. Money supply expanded at rates that would have been impossible under Bretton Woods. And inflation returned in 2021 to 2023 at levels not seen since the 1970s. The argument defenders make is that fiat currency allowed flexibility to respond to crises. The 2008 response, COVID stimulus, unemployment insurance expansions, none would have been possible under a gold standard. They're correct, but they're describing the problem, not the solution. The flexibility to print unlimited money is also the flexibility to destroy savings, distort markets, and transfer wealth from citizens to governments. The ability to respond to crises with monetary expansion creates moral hazard. It encourages risk-taking because participants know they'll be bailed out. It rewards debt and punishes saving. It allows governments to spend without the political cost of raising taxes. Every advantage of fiat currency is simultaneously a mechanism for abuse, and governments have consistently chosen abuse. Some defend Nixon's decision as necessary. They argue Bretton Woods was unsustainable because it required the U.S. to maintain gold convertibility while running deficits to supply global liquidity, the Triffan dilemma. The system had internal contradictions. Collapse was inevitable. This argument concedes too much. Bretton Woods had problems, but the problem was U.S. policy, not the gold standard. If the U.S. had limited spending to what it could finance without printing excess dollars, convertibility could have continued. France successfully maintained gold convertibility for years. Switzerland did it until the 1990s. The gold standard didn't fail. The United States chose to abandon it rather than accept spending constraints. The alternative Nixon rejected was political discipline. Cut spending, end the Vietnam War, scale back Great Society programs, accept recession if necessary to restore monetary stability. This path was politically costly. It would have hurt his re-election chances, but it would have preserved the monetary system. Nixon chose the politically easy path: close the gold window, print money, finance spending without limit, let future administrations deal with the consequences. And those consequences have been dealt with the same way. More printing, more debt, more inflation, more instability. The question facing anyone today is not whether fiat currency can work in theory. In theory, responsible central banks could maintain stable money without gold. In practice, they never do. Political pressure always wins. Crises are always met with printing. Discipline is always sacrificed for short-term expediency. This is why understanding 1971 matters. It wasn't an aberration. It was a choice. Nixon had alternatives. He chose the path that maximized short-term political gain at the expense of long-term monetary stability. Every administration since has made the same choice when faced with the same decision: print or face consequences. They print. The financial system we live in today, floating exchange rates, unlimited money printing, $36 trillion in federal debt, routine currency crises, asset bubbles every decade, is the direct result of 15 minutes on television in August 1971. That's not hyperbole. None of this would exist under Bretton Woods. The constraints prevented it. Whether the current system is sustainable is the only question that matters. Can governments continue printing unlimited amounts of currency while maintaining value? Can debt grow faster than the economy indefinitely? Can central banks control inflation while financing massive deficits? History suggests no. Every fiat currency eventually fails. The Roman denarius, the French assignat, the German mark, the Argentine peso, the Venezuelan bolivar, they all followed the same path. Start with something valuable, replace it with paper, print the paper, hyperinflate, collapse. The US dollar has lasted longer than most. It benefits from being the global reserve currency. Other countries must hold dollars for international trade. This creates artificial demand that props up the value. But that advantage is declining. China promotes yuan usage. Russia and Iran trade in local currencies. Countries accumulate gold instead of dollars. The privilege is eroding. When the dollar loses reserve status, not if when, the consequences will be severe. The US will no longer be able to print money and export the inflation to other countries holding dollars as reserves. Domestic inflation will reflect the full extent of money printing without the cushion of foreign demand. The choice will be stark: stop printing and accept depression-level economic contraction, or continue printing and accept hyperinflation that destroys the currency entirely. There is no third option, no middle path, no compromise that preserves both the currency and the government's ability to spend without limit. This endgame was set in motion on August 15, 1971. Nixon didn't create the destination. He just removed the guardrails that prevented the car from going off the cliff. Every president since has accelerated toward the edge. We're closer now than we've ever been. The federal debt exceeds GDP. Money supply expansion in 2022-2021 was unprecedented. Inflation returned at levels not seen since Volcker, and the only question is whether we'll break before the end or drive straight over. 15 minutes changed everything. The speech ended, the gold window closed, Bretton Woods died, and money became whatever government said it was. That transformation created the modern world. The wealth, the debt, the instability, the crisis. All of it traces back to a Sunday evening in August 1971, when Richard Nixon decided that gold was an inconvenience and promises were sufficient. Those who understand this see the present clearly. Those who don't keep trusting the same promises that have been broken repeatedly for 50 years. The choice between understanding and ignorance has never been more consequential. This is Decoded Economics. Subscribe to see the future before it arrives.